Unlocking the Bible by David Pawson. Unlocking Malachi. Introduction. The background to the book of Malachi is very similar to that of Haggai and Zechariah. It was written 100 years after the return of Judah from exile in Babylon. Things were not good. Jerusalem was still relatively deserted, and the farmland was largely barren and uncultivated. Recent harvests had been poor, and swarms of locusts and lack of food made life hard and precarious. The temple had been finished in 520 BC, but it was so small compared to Solomon's that it had done little to lift morale. Although Nehemiah had repaired the walls, the people still preferred living out in the country, where they could more easily hide from attack. They had not built a palace because they didn't have a king, although Zerubbabel, their governor, was the rightful heir in the royal line of David. So Judah now comprised a small hill town and some surrounding villages, a pale reflection of the kingdom of David in its heyday. The people were disappointed, disillusioned, and even despairing. They were beginning to ask whether it had been worthwhile returning to Judah at all. They said, "We've been back 100 years, and where's this kingdom we were going to build?" There was just one piece of good news. They had learnt their lesson about idolatry in the exile. Never again did they go after other gods or seek to change their religion. But having said that, the practice of this religion had become a formality. The people attended the temple, but it was largely out of tradition, a ritual without reality, and certainly no longer a priority. They were now asking what was the minimum amount of time they needed to spend on religious activity, and what was the minimum amount of money they could get away with. Furthermore, the priests were like the people. They were not bothered about how many people came to attend the services, as long as they just got through it and made their living. The services were conducted in a casual and careless manner, as if anything would do for God. With this attitude in the religious life, it was no surprise that it affected their moral life too. When people question the purpose of bothering about God, it's not long before they stop bothering to be godly. Or to put it more simply, when one generation is asking, "Why bother about God?" the next generation will be asking, "Why be good?" So, for example, even though they knew that trading on the Sabbath was wrong, they built their equivalent of out-of-town supermarkets just outside the gates so they could open them on the Sabbath. Consumerism took over, with a devastating effect on family life. The question, "Why be faithful to God?" soon became, "Why be faithful to your wife?" especially when your wife gets older and loses her sex appeal. Why not trade her in for a newer model? Furthermore, the nation was short of women following the return from Babylon, so they were marrying outside of the people of God. Not only were they divorcing and remarrying, but also they were remarrying non-Jewish women in contravention of the law of God. The city of Jerusalem was being filled with abandoned wives, and since there was no welfare state, widows, orphans, and abandoned wives had an especially hard time. They didn't have a government to blame, but they did have a God to blame, which is precisely what they did. They said, "God's not bothered about us, so we're not bothered about him." It sounded very impressive. God has stopped loving us, so we've just stopped loving him. We can't believe in a God of love Just look at the situation we're in. We have to look after ourselves. He's abandoned us, so we might as well just look after number one. Their criticism of God had two sides to it. On the one hand, they said, God doesn't reward good living, and on the other hand, he doesn't punish bad living, so why bother? This was the situation that Malachi had to deal with. His whole prophecy was in prose, not poetry, an indication that God had lost his feelings for his people. So much so that he wouldn't talk to them again for another 400 years. This was his last word, and a very cool word at that. Unique features. The book of Malachi has 5 unique features. Number 1, there is more of God's speech in Malachi than in any other of the prophetic books. Of its 55 verses, 47, i.e. 85%, are the direct words of God. Number 2, this prophecy is anonymous. Most people think that Malachi is the name of the author, but it's not actually a name at all. It simply means messenger. Malachi is never used as a name anywhere else in the Old Testament, but it's frequently used to mean messenger. So he's just an anonymous messenger, a nobody who brings God's last word to his people in Israel. The Jews suspected that the author was Ezra, but we have no evidence to decide one way or another. Number 3. Malachi is unusual in that he is the one prophet who had dialogues with people. It is clear that he spoke the prophecy and was heckled because he reports the heckling. His hearers were offended by his preaching because his basic message was, you started all this. It was not God who stopped being bothered about you. You did it first. If you stop bothering about God, he won't be bothered about you. In Romans in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul explains that men gave God up, so God gave men up, or rather gave them over, to what they wanted. In the same way, when a nation gives God up, he gives them over to what they want. So the prophecy takes the form of sharp exchanges between the prophet and the people. On 12 occasions he says, but you say, implying interruption of one sort or another. Number 4. This is prose, not poetry, because God's feelings have dried up. God feels exhausted by his people, and therefore won't talk to them for another 400 years. So we see God's heart here. Wouldn't you be fed up if, having taken them to exile and brought them home, they now can't be bothered about you? Number 5. The 5th feature is that this is God's last word. Perhaps the Christian order of the books in the Old Testament is right after all. The Hebrew scriptures finish with Chronicles. This was God's last message to them, and the last word in it was curse. To this day, whenever the Jews read Malachi in the synagogue, they do not read the last verse, lest he smite the land with a curse. Instead, they return to verse 5, so that they don't end up with the word curse. They refuse to end with God's last word. You can see an outline of the book on page 760 and 761. Past Survival, Chapter 1, verse 1 to 5. To understand the first verses in the book, we need to go back 1,500 years. Malachi announces that God loved Jacob and hated Esau, the twins whose attitudes towards each other had not been good. It seems a strange statement to our ears. It is important to realize that in the Bible, the words loved and hated do not mean what they mean in English. To love someone is to care for them and seek their highest good. To hate someone in biblical language is not to care for someone and not to seek his or her good. So when Jesus said, "You're not worthy to follow me if you don't hate your father and mother," he wasn't meaning that his hearers must have bitterness and resentment towards them, but rather that they should care for him more than them. Furthermore, God is not just talking about Jacob and Esau in the past, but about the two nations of Israel and Edom in Malachi's day. He's reminding them that over the previous 100 years, he has done nothing but good for Israel and has punished Edom. When the Babylonians came to take the Jews into exile, the Edomites, the descendants of Esau living over the Jordan, were delighted and joined in. Their cry was, "Hooray, they're finished." They joined in the horrific destruction, taking the babies of the Jews by the heels and bashing them out against the Jerusalem wall. Since that day, Edom had been under God's judgment. It came over a long period of time. God threw them out of their home city of Petra by bringing the Arabs against them. They were forced to scratch a living in the Negev desert, where there were no crops. So in Malachi, God told Israel that he had done all this to Edom because of what they had done to the Jews. "I have loved you, and I haven't cared for them." Malachi is asking them to think about their survival in a comparison to Edom and to be grateful to God. The lesson is clear. When we complain to God, we should think about what he's done to other people and reflect on what he's done for us and be grateful. Behind all of Malachi's preaching, there is a particular idea of God that we do well to grasp. He sees God in three functions, as the whole Old Testament does, areas easily forgotten by those who don't read the Old Testament. We read the New Testament and think God is the loving Father, but these three dimensions of God, as seen in the Old Testament, are vital. He is the Creator in our past, the King in our present, and the Judge of our future. We must remember this framework when we approach issues concerning God. Present Sins, chapter 1, verse 6 to chapter 3, verse 15. Priests, chapter 1, verse 6 to chapter 2, verse 9. The first people whom Malachi attacks are the priests. God is seen as Father and as Master and should be respected. Instead, they were treating God with contempt. Too often in church services, God is treated with familiarity rather than with reverence and respect. Here he tells the priests that they are bringing God into disrepute and dishonour. Once again, the people respond by asking how. He replies with two instances. Firstly, cheap sacrifices. The people were offering cheap sacrifices. Instead of choosing the best lamb, as detailed in the law of Moses, they were choosing the worst, blind and crippled animals to offer to God. Malachi points out that in not offering to God the best, they were doing less than they would for the Persian governor. You give God what's left over. You give someone else the best you can give. Secondly, he tells them that God's name is great among the nations, but not among them, so that the Gentiles have more reverence for God than they do. The message is quite devastating. Popular sermons. Next, he condemns the priests for telling the people what they want to hear rather than teaching them the law. They were supposed to be God-fearers, not men-pleasers. Here again is a fundamental temptation and pressure on those who serve God in the church. It's so easy to give people what they want to hear and not to disturb them. If they are disturbed, you know you won't be invited back. Malachi reminds them of God's covenant with Levi back at the time of Moses, when the priests were told that they wouldn't need to work for pay, but would be supported by the others, provided that they taught people to fear the Lord. But now they were not teaching people to fear the Lord. The Levitical priests were told that people must be able to see godly lives and not just hear their words. Their lips and their lives must be given the same message. So he tells them they are already under a curse and there is worse to come. Many of their children will die and the priesthood will come to an end if this behaviour continues. People, chapter 2, verse 10 to chapter 3, verse 15. Next, Malachi focused on the people. There were 5 things which showed that both their belief and their behaviour were slipping. Mixed marriages. The young people were marrying outside of the people of God. Throughout Israel's history as a nation, God had insisted that the people must marry from within the nation. This practice is also happening in the church. If you marry a child of the devil, you're going to have problems with your father-in-law, quite apart from a lifetime of great unhappiness. Heartless divorce. The second problem was what we might term heartless divorce. Some practiced consecutive polygamy. Simultaneous polygamy is where men have more wives than one at the same time. Consecutive polygamy is where they have as many wives as they want, provided they have them one at a time. This is another practice that has become all too common within the church, but it hurt God because every marriage is made in God's sight, whether it's in a registry office or a church. So every marriage comes under the law of God. God's law, according to Jesus, is that consecutive polygamy amounts to adultery, though it would seem that most preachers today are frightened of saying so. Malachi had faced this, and we have to face it too, but it's probably the most unpopular thing to face in today's church. God simply says, I hate divorce. Doubtful questions. When God accused the people of breaking the covenant, they replied, but how are we breaking it? He replied that they were breaking the covenant with each other by marrying outside the people of God. They thought they were innocent and didn't like this preacher accusing them. People don't mind you making general statements, but when you spell it out in particular ways, it hurts. Malachi explained that this was wearying God. He was effectively saying, you're saying, how can you believe in a God of love when this is happening? How dare you ask such questions? You ask, where is the justice of God? How dare you ask that question? Judgment will come, although it may not come immediately, because God is patient with us. But don't ever accuse God of being unfair and of being indifferent to bad things going on. As if this wasn't bad enough, Malachi shocked the people by telling them that when God came to punish bad people, he would start in his temple. They were crying out to God to deal with bad people, but when he came, it would be them that he would deal with. The priests would be the first to be judged, and then the people. He lists the people who don't fear God: sorcerers, adulterers, perjurers, those who are defrauding labourers of their wages, those who deliberately withhold payment of bills, those who oppress widows and the fatherless, and those who deprive foreigners of justice. It's pretty direct talking. At this point, there's a definite change of tone. It is as if God speaks from his heart. He explains that the fact that the people are not destroyed is part of his mercy. While Judah has a long history of unfaithfulness, he still remains faithful. They may break his covenant, but he will remain committed to them. God is saying, return to me and I will return to you. It is true that when we get away from God, he gets away from us. But when we return to him, he returns to us. God is in a dynamic two-way relationship with his people, and he responds to them all the time. God is constantly meeting us where we are, responding to us, reflecting our attitude to him. Some people think of God as sitting way up in heaven far away and making decrees and pushing us around like puppets. But that's not the Bible picture. The Bible shows God as one who is responding to us all the time, who changes his mind when we change, who repents when we repent, who returns to us when we return to him. It's a dynamic relationship. Unpaid tithes. Next, Malachi tells them that they are stealing from God. Once again, the people question the suggestion, asking how? We've never stolen from God. Again, the reply is sharp. You have left unpaid tithes and offerings. Malachi effectively pins them to the ground, and they object. He explains that they have not kept up the 10% tithe to God or the voluntary offerings, and so are under a curse because of the law of tithing. The law of Moses says that if you pay, God blesses you, and if you don't, he curses you to the 3rd and 4th generation. Christians are not, of course, under that law. I have never preached tithing in my life. I've preached giving, because in the New Testament we're to give out of gratitude. The Lord does not want your gift if you don't want to give it. But in the Old Testament they had to tithe. Preaching tithing today will always cause problems. My wife and I once listened to a young man in a church preaching on tithing. Most who do this focus on the blessings and miss out the curses, but at least he was consistent. But the message was appalling. He told the congregation that if they didn't tithe, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would suffer, that God would punish those who broke the tithing law to the 3rd and 4th generation. They would be under a curse. So when they came to take up the offering, they took the largest amount for years, which was hardly surprising. But afterwards I told the leaders of that church that it was wicked teaching, for it makes people give out of fear. The Lord loves a cheerful giver, and we give under the new covenant of grace. For some people tithing would be far too little, and for others it would be far too much. We need to be much more flexible. But Malachi could legitimately say that the people were already under a curse because they hadn't brought the tithes. If they wanted to know blessing again, they would need to bring all the tithes into the Lord's storehouse, and God would open the windows of heaven and pour out such a blessing as could not be contained. The context of this promise suggests that he literally meant clouds and rain to end the drought. Slanderous talk. Malachi continued his condemnation by accusing the people of slanderous talk. Once again they responded by asking how they had slandered God. Malachi said that it was the way they had denigrated the service of God, claiming that there was no point, because even evildoers prospered. In so doing they claimed that God wasn't Lord and didn't know what he was doing. Did all this have any effect? Was Malachi as effective a preacher as Haggai and Zechariah had been? Did the people respond? The answer is that some did. They discussed the message and they repented. They owned up to their responsibilities and put things right. God even wrote down in a book the names of those who were fervent in their response. Future separation. Chapter 3 verse 16 to chapter 4 verse 6. In the final section, Malachi outlined the separation within the people of God. He said that within Israel there was coming a day when they would be divided into two. The prophets called it the day of the Lord. It is mentioned in other prophets such as Zechariah, Amos and Joel. It's a day of reckoning, of settling accounts and of judgment. On that day there will only be two groups, those who serve God and those who don't. This passage includes a lovely description of life for the righteous. I used to get up at 4 a.m. to milk 90 cows on a farm in Northumberland. During the winter, we kept the cattle indoors and fed them on cake and hay for months. Then came the day when we let them out for the first time in the spring. If you know anything about country life, you know what happened next. Even the oldest cow gambled like a lamb. Large lumbering cows would jump around the field for joy. Malachi says this is how it will be for the people of God. They too will leap for joy on the day when God comes to bring final salvation to his people. Those who are rejected on that day are described as like stubble burned after harvest. In the days when this was legal in the UK, all that would be left was ash. Just as the calves leaping in a green field under the sun is a picture of the righteous, the ashes of stubble is a picture of those who have not responded to God. There are 3 things we must note at this point. Number 1. Israel as a people will survive. Malachi said on behalf of God, I don't change, I don't go back on my word, so we can be sure that there will always be an Israel. Number 2, but it is also clear that some in Israel will be lost. Obviously, not every Jew who has ever lived will be saved, nor does it mean that the Jews do not need the gospel. Number 3, there are statements that some outside Israel will be saved. Malachi says there will be those among the nations who will be part of the righteous. So we have hints of what would come in the New Testament. Postscript, chapter 4, verse 4 to 6. The last 3 verses are built around the 2 greatest men in the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. This is God's last appeal to his people of Israel in the Old Testament, his last word for 400 years before the opening of the New. God calls the people to remember Moses and return to the law, for God is their great king. Then he says that God will give them another chance. He will send one more prophet to them, an Elijah figure who will come to challenge them. Elijah was the first major prophet to challenge the idolatry and immorality of Israel, while Moses was the prophet who led them out of Egypt and who gave them the covenant and the law. So the Old Testament closes with these words, if they don't listen to Elijah, then the land will be smitten with a curse. They would get one last chance before the day of the Lord, one more prophet to prepare the way of the Lord. For over 400 years they waited for that to happen. They were occupied by Persians, Egyptians, Syrians, Greeks and Romans, and finally the chance came. Suddenly there was a man dressed like Elijah, eating locusts and wild honey just like Elijah. The country flocked to hear this man, who preached the message that Malachi said he would preach. He called people back to wisdom and back to family life, but he'd only come as a forerunner to prepare the way for the Lord Jesus. When you turn to the New Testament, you find that there was a great debate about whether John the Baptist was Elijah. On 2 occasions, Jesus said that Elijah was his cousin, John. Matthew chapter 11 verse 7 to 14 and Matthew 17 verse 9 to 13. So Malachi and Matthew go side by side in our Bible. Matthew tells us how Elijah did come in the person of John the Baptist. He deliberately wore the clothes of Elijah and ate the food of Elijah. This was the revelation of God's next move. When Jesus reached a watershed after 2.5 years of his ministry and took the disciples to the foot of Mount Hermon and asked, "Who do people think I am?" they said, "Well, some think you're a reincarnation of Jeremiah or somebody else." But Jesus asked who they thought he was. Peter saw the truth and said, "Well, you have lived before, haven't you? But not down here. You've lived up there. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then Jesus took Peter, James and John up the mountain, and Moses and Elijah appeared and talked to Jesus. Malachi promised it, and it all came together. Christian application. Number 1. We are told in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that all these Old Testament examples are written for the use of Christians. What happened to the Jewish nation can easily happen to us. Apathy, disbelief, immorality and heartlessness can afflict the Christian believer too. Number 2. We must let the New Testament interpret the Old. We are not under Sabbath or tithing laws, but we are under the law of Christ, which is stricter than the law of Moses on divorce and remarriage, and on many other issues. Number 3. On the other hand, we must not be libertine in the way we treat God's grace. Too many Christians effectively lose the fear of God. If we do that, we have not fully grasped the gospel of Christ. Number 4. We need to remember that judgment begins at the house of God. The New Testament writers follow the same pattern as Malachi when it comes to judgment. When God comes to judge, he first judges his people and then he judges everybody else. There will be a separation even of people in church. We mustn't be complacent, assuming that because we made a decision for Christ in the past, we are okay. We must be eager to make our calling and election sure, and to persevere in the things of God, if we do not want to face the judgment that came on the people of Malachi's day.